はい、皆さんよろしいでしょうか。ご着席いただけま
Ladies
した
and
でしょうか。
gentlemen, please take your seats.
それではお時間となりましたので、
It is
第
time
2
for
部
us
に移
to
りたいと思
begin
います。
part 2 of the forum. So please be seated.
よろしいですか。それではモデレーターの筒井さん、よろしくお願いい
I
た
would
しま
like to
す。
hand over to the moderator, Professor Tsutsui,
Well,
please.
thank you very much, everyone, for coming to this session, second panel. My name is Kiyoteru Tsutsui. I'm a faculty member in the sociology department at Stanford University, but more relevant here, I'm director of the Japan program at Asia Pacific Research Center at Stanford. And on behalf of Stanford University, Freeman Spogler Institute, and Asia Pacific Research Center, we'd like to thank the Asia Pacific Initiative for hosting this event here, and especially for the Yomiuri Shimbun for helping with the organization and the reporting and all of that. So the second session is about democracy and authoritarian challenges. And I would like to challenge any event organizers in the world to put together a panel that is better than these two people to speak on these issues. We have two fantastic scholars to speak on those topics. So I'd rather really get started right away so that you will get as much insight from these two excellent scholars as possible. So much has been said about the recent decline in democracies and the growing challenges of authoritarianism in the world. And Larry Diamond here has written this book, Ill Winds, which has been translated into Japanese last year, I think, which was written a couple years ago. And in that book, he was very alarmed about the recent developments, and he talked about how this situation of democracies today might be the worst in the 40-some years of his career watching democracies and evolution of democracies in the world. So I'd like to start with this question to Professor Diamond about his observation of what's going on today. Given that it has been a couple of years, he wrote this book in the dark shadows of the Trump administration in the United States and all of those. China still very much rising. Ukraine war hadn't happened at the time. So I would like to ask Larry's views today, whether it has, things have gotten better since the time he wrote the book, or things have gotten worse. Putting in the recent democratic recession in the historical context, what are your views on the state of democracies in the world today? And maybe you can talk also about what factors really contributed to the decline, and if there's a slightly upward trajectory right now, what have changed today?
Thank you, Kyo, and it's great to be with all of you at this revered institution in American engagement with Japan. The world entered a democratic recession, I think around 2006, after a long period of more or less continuous expansion of freedom and democracy in the world, a very gradual expansion that began with the so-called third wave in the mid-1970s and then exploded in the late 1980s and 1990s, and then a kind of slowing down again. And around 2006, we started trending downward in terms of levels of democracy and levels of freedom. It's not that those levels are so much lower today than they were in 2006. It's that they've been creeping downward steadily since 2006. And the method of democratic demise in the world during this period has basically been by gradual deterioration. So, if democracy, the quality of democracy starts deteriorating and anti-democratic forces start rising, it should be deeply worrisome to us, not only for normative reasons, but because it could mean that democracy in many of these countries will essentially disappear, as it has, for example, in Hungary, without much of the world fully acknowledging it. Let me say what has changed since my book was first published in English, and then what hasn't changed, okay? What has changed is that democracy in the United States is in better shape. And you ask what was contributing to the trends that I identified, the global democratic recession. One major contributing factor was the decline of democracy in the United States and our severe political polarization and the rise of right-wing illiberal populism. And its rise in Europe as well, and the retreat of democracy, as I mentioned, in Hungary. And the damage this did to the image of democracy globally, the sense that democracy was a system that worked, that was resilient, that was morally, no form of government is ever morally consistent, but, had some degree of moral consistency, and increasingly we looked like hypocrites. And it was happening at a time when China was rising relentlessly in the last 3 decades or so, but particularly in this century, and when Russia seemed, quote, resurgent. Judgments about regimes in the world, regime legitimacy, which way the world is going, they're always comparative, right? People are always comparing their regime against other regimes and certain types of regimes against other types of regimes globally. And for quite some time, autocracy, even severe autocracy, in the form of the People's Republic of China in particular, just seemed to work better, to get more done, to believe in itself more, and to be more dynamic. Now, I think we can explore in greater depth, Kiyo, if you want to, why democracy in the US is not as much in crisis now as it was, frankly, during the 4 years of the Donald Trump administration, which were the 4 worst years for democracy in the United States in many decades, if not since the Civil War. But it's not only because Trump lost power, it's because we had a president come in who was more clearly committed to democracy. We made some important and promising political reforms that I talk about in my book at the state level, which is where I think we're going to get a lot of political reforms. And in 2022, even though a lot of the people who had essentially voted to sanction the effort to overturn undemocratically the 2020 presidential election in the Republican Party took control of the Congress, even so, they did so by a much smaller margin, and the extreme election deniers in the United States, in the states that really mattered, the swing states, were virtually all defeated. The other big thing that's happened is that authoritarianism doesn't look like such a great proposition today. Xi Jinping has just so massively mismanaged COVID. And then he turns on a dime all of a sudden and says, okay, you want me to open up? I'll open up. If 1 million of you die, and it could be 2 million, too bad, you asked for it. And I repeat, I'm sorry, I don't say this because I'm an American nationalist or an anti-communist. I say this because Xi Jinping is who he is. Mao murdered, 30 million Chinese? No one really knows. You think Xi Jinping is not capable of that? I think that his image in the world now is more and more tarnished. Economic growth in China is severely impaired. We'll see if it recovers, and how much. But the competition between democracy and authoritarianism doesn't look as depressing for the Democrats as it did just 2 or 3 years ago. And of course, as was noted in the last session, Putin has just catastrophically miscalculated. And I think that this gives us new means, Kyo, to wage the argument that when you don't have checks and balances of some kind, even without, say, Western or liberal democracy, even if you don't have full electoral accountability, when you don't have some checks and balances and diffusion of power and constitutional processes, then unaccountable, power-hungry rulers are liable to make egregious and catastrophic mistakes. And this is not only a lesson we're seeing unfold now in China and Russia in a couple of different ways, but look what's happening in Iran now. I mean, Iran is really unraveling. The economy is a basket case. The regime is, maybe got 20% of the population that support it. Large numbers of Iranian youth have made clear they're willing to die rather than live under this regime any further. Women have stepped forward and risked their lives to challenge this regime. Many of them have paid the ultimate price. Venezuela, you've had at least a quarter of the population leave Venezuela because the Bolivarian socialist dictatorship has run the country into the ground. Now, what has not changed is some of the deeper drivers of the democratic recession. And to my mind, the single biggest one, which by the way doesn't seem to be as big a problem in Japan as in many other advanced industrial democracies, so if anybody can either tell me that's not true or explain why, I'd love to hear it. But the biggest problem, I think, is social media. I cannot tell you how much damage it's done to destroy the social fabric of truth and credibility and polarize society into tribal camps who don't have the same facts. I mean, 70% of the Republican Party, of reliable Republican voters, really believes, without any evidence, and with 80 different courts after the 2020 election, including courts with Trump-appointed judges ruling otherwise, 70% of them really believe that Trump won the 2020 election. And a lot of that is due to disinformation and social media. And we have not found a way to temper that, fight that, and win the battle for truth. The second thing is the corrupting influence of dirty money around the world and its corrosive effect on the rule of law in the United States and Europe and the quality of our institutions. Again, I don't know about Japan. Someone here can comment on that. And the third, and I'll close with this, two others. One has been deindustrialization in the United States and Europe, and the shift of manufacturing jobs to less developed economies, which has hollowed out the industrial working class and has not only just immiserated them or made life difficult for them in terms of their income, but it's been humiliating for them. Work is a very important part of identity. And if you lose your job, you know, you've kind of lost your moorings in a way. And then they see all these immigrants coming into the United States with no control of our borders, or at least that's the narrative. But right now, I really think we don't have control of our borders. And it's been a very fertile formula for for feeding this right-wing populism. So these factors really haven't changed much, and I think continue to make us very vulnerable in Europe and the United States.
So we can come back to U.S. democracy in a little bit, but as Larry pointed out, there were certainly very concerning trends. If you look at, and the people who make arguments about the decline of democracies, they use statistics from VDEM or Freedom House. And if you look at the historical arc of the democracy scores, it is still going up. And the decline in the last 5-10 years is really pretty much within the margins of errors. That's not to say that we shouldn't be concerned about the decline of democracy, but we need to have a more of a historical perspective in interpreting what has been going on in the last 10 years or so. And on that, there was some conversations about the meaning of the year 2022 in the earlier panel. And I'd like to think about the meaning of 2022 in terms of democracy in the world. Larry has already alluded to the relative rehabilitation of democracy in the US. And Frank, you have been following the sort of confrontation between democracy and authoritarianism really since the end of the Cold War with your book on the end of history. And one of the biggest, the biggest event, political event of 2022 was Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And in the context of the history of democracy, especially in that particular region, how do you characterize the Ukraine war and what happened after that, especially in terms of NATO's revival? It was dying, according to somebody like President Macron. But now it's expanding, it's going strong. So something really changed to consolidate the alliance of democracies. So what are your views on what happened in Ukraine and where it is going, especially in terms of European democracies?
Well, I think that there's really two implications of the Ukraine war. This was not a war really about territory between two countries that was really just of interest to Russia and Ukraine. I think that it had a much broader significance for the parties involved, and it should have a significance to almost everybody else in the world that cares about world order and how geopolitics is structured. So this gets back to the debate that Mike McFall in the last session alluded to over what caused the war in the first place. There is a narrative out there that's pushed by especially people with a more realist bent like Henry Kissinger that would say that the war was driven in a way by the United States or by NATO that wanted to expand NATO up to Russia's borders, deny it a buffer zone that would be constituted either by Eastern Europe or by Ukraine itself, and that the Russians acted defensively. And I think that this is wrong for quite a number of reasons. I mean, first of all, no one was really interested in expanding NATO, although it was suggested that Ukraine and Georgia could join NATO at the Bucharest summit in 2008. It was clear that nobody really wanted to let them in for kind of obvious reasons. I think the real motive was one that Vladimir Putin articulated at great length. He wrote a very long 5,000-word article in the summer of 2020, is that right? 2021, explaining that basically the Russians and Ukrainians are one people, that the collapse of the Soviet Union was one of the biggest historical mistakes, that all of these countries belong together under the same sovereignty. He repeated this in a long speech he gave just before the war began, a little bit less than a year ago. And if you look at these different statements, it's very clear that the thing that really bothers him is the whole post-war European settlement that emerged with the collapse of the former Soviet Union in 1991. And, you know, he was demanding not just that Ukraine not enter NATO, he was basically saying that all of the Eastern European members of NATO that had joined since the 1990s should also basically, you know, become neutral. So in other words, you know, what we used to call Europe whole and free with great pleasure because of the expansion of democracy was really what bothered Putin. And it represented not a security threat, but a political threat. Because if you could have an actual democracy flourish in a Slavic country that was part of the former Soviet Union, culturally very close to Russia, then why couldn't it flourish in Russia itself? And there was a liberal opposition, and I think that that was really the threat to the extent that Putin was driven by insecurity. It was not military insecurity, it was political insecurity, and his cure for that really would be to undo the larger European settlement that had happened after 91. However, second big issue that really affects everybody in the world is whether a country can use military force to change borders and acquire territory. There was a very strong norm established after the Second World War that modern countries, or countries in general, don't do this. And by and large, you know, you had some exceptions like Iraq's invasion of Kuwait and so forth, but this was a norm that was broadly accepted. I remember the Kenyan representative who was on the Security Council, you know, at the time of the February invasion, gave this wonderful speech where he said, look, we Kenyans come from different ethnic groups. Our borders are completely drawn by colonial powers. They make no sense. But if every one of us, you know, wanted to use military force to change those borders, you know, we'd never be free of violence ever. And I think that that was a general view that everyone had after 1945, that, you know, at least you're not going to see big powers trying to take advantage of little powers in that exploitative way. And I think that that's really what's hit this country, because up until the invasion of Ukraine, you know, it was kind of plausible that these big powers are going to be prudent and, you know, think about their interests in this broader way. And then all of a sudden, here's one big country trying to grab its neighbor. And all of a sudden, I think for everybody here, the possibility that was always present, but nobody really believed that China could grab Taiwan, suddenly became, you know, much more vivid, because you can see Russia trying to grab Ukraine, and you can imagine Chinese troops landing on the beach in Taiwan and doing what the Russians were trying to do in Ukraine. So that was the other big, broad norm, and I think that that's part of the reason why it's had the really amazing effect, you know, here that it has in other parts of the world. But I would point out that there is a little bit of myopia among the democracies of the world in sort of thinking that they have. So it's true. So I'm sorry, I didn't answer this part of your question. So the other thing that I think surprised people was the solidarity within the NATO alliance. I certainly wasn't expecting that. You know, your turnaround in defense policy was prefigured by the German Zeitenwende. Its reversal, you know, for 40 years they had an Ostpolitik that saw reconciliation with Russia to be central. There was a lot of war guilt in a certain sense that Germany in World War II had invaded Russia and they needed to have a good relationship. They had become pacifists. They were not going to be a military power. German young people were brought up under this assumption that never again would they fight another war, and all of a sudden in February they declared basically what you just declared. They're going to double their defense budget, and they're going to drop this Eastern orientation in their foreign policy. So all of this was really quite remarkable and very, in a way, reassuring about the strength and solidarity among democracies. But we sometimes forget that there's a global South out there, and a lot of countries don't buy into this narrative. So I think, there's several big disappointments. One of them is India, and it gets to the question of whether the issue really is democracy versus authoritarian government, because there's no Prime Minister Modi has been eroding Indian democracy, but broadly speaking, India has been a pretty good democracy since its independence, and yet they don't take democracy at all seriously as a factor in their foreign policy. They buy weapons. They used to buy weapons from the former Soviet Union, and they prize their neutrality. They never wanted to line up with the West. A country like South Africa is a democracy. It transitioned to a democracy in the early 1990s. But, it was mistreated by democracies, including by the United States, by Britain, by other Western democracies because of the colonial legacy. And so they just don't, regard solidarity with other democracies as a, important dimension of their foreign policy. So I think it's a little bit of a mixed bag. I'm very encouraged by the solidarity that's been shown, especially here and in Europe, but we have to remember that that's not by any means the whole world.
Thank you. I want to come back and dig deeper into the issue of democracy versus authoritarianism, whether that's the appropriate framing or not. But I don't want to let this moment pass without giving Larry a chance to talk about Taiwan and what it means to defend Taiwan in the context of defending democracy in the world. I know you feel passionate about this topic, so could you speak a little bit, linking this session to the earlier session, what does it mean to defend Taiwan in the context of democracy versus authoritarianism?
So when I left at the end of, 2021 as the co-editor of the Journal of Democracy after 32 years, I wrote, I wrote an essay kind of reflecting on the long arc of democratic change during that period and the challenges ahead. And this was, 2 months before Putin invaded Ukraine, and Xi hasn't invaded Taiwan yet. But I said what I think was obvious then, that these were the two frontline states for the battle for global democracy, and that I felt much of what would happen in the world in terms of the future of democracy would involve, what happened in these two states. Could they survive as democracies under pressure and threat from these two great power autocracies or not? That question is unresolved in both of these two frontline states as we sit here, and as Frank has said many times, it is being tested on the battlegrounds in Ukraine at horrific human cost. Taiwan is a very vibrant democracy. There are 3 liberal democracies in East Asia, Japan, Taiwan, and Korea. I think Taiwan is at least as democratic as any of them. It has a very vigorous civil society, a lot of innovation. Of course, it has deep divisions in the society to a degree that I don't think Japan does, because of the division over Taiwan's identity and Taiwan's, geopolitical future. But if such a, there is wide agreement among comparative scholars of democracy that Taiwan is one of the great success stories of the third wave of global democratization. If that can just be wiped off the map, like Hitler wiped Czech democracy off, the Czechoslovakia democracy off the map, and essentially said in the late 1930s, or had the rest of the world say, nice little democracy you had there, it's a pity it can't survive. The same way we have essentially said, nice little kind of free society you had in Hong Kong, sorry it couldn't survive. If Taiwan can just be wiped out like that by the will and lust for power and domination of the most powerful authoritarian state in the world, what does that mean for the future of democracy and freedom? Now, I'm very worried about Taiwan because I think that I agree with everything Oriana said. There is going to be a PRC military invasion of Taiwan probably in this decade, unless it is deterred. And the three most important actors in deterring it are, of course, Taiwan, the United States, and Japan. And I think that successful deterrence must involve coordination among all three on strictly military terms, on not only increased defense capacity, but making sure that we buy the right kinds of weapons to counter a likely Chinese amphibious invasion, and to be prepared to impose such heavy costs on a Chinese invading force that she will say it's just not worth the risk. What else I can say is that democracy is about uncertainty. And there is a presidential election coming in January of 2024 in Taiwan. There is a battle going on for the soul of the KMT between an extreme and even anti-American, very accommodationist, deep blue camp within the KMT. And I'd say a more moderate and pragmatic faction of the KMT that I think is more committed to defending the country. And I would put in that camp the chairman of the KMT, Eric Chu, and the person who I think will be the KMT presidential candidate, the mayor of New Taipei, Ho Yu-yi. William Lai has the vice president who alarms and angers Beijing because he's seen as pro-independence more than Tsai Ing-wen, and has made a few statements that, taken out of context, can make it seem like he's another Chen Shui-bian who's going to try and inch Taiwan toward independence. I've met him and talked to him even fairly recently. I don't think he's going to do that because I think he's smart enough to see how suicidal that would be. But, this is, it's going to be another very important test. And China is going to intervene however it thinks it can in the Taiwan presidential election by trying to ensure that the DPP loses, trying to manipulate the information environment. I mean, Taiwan spends an enormous amount of money just trying to track United Front agents in Taiwan, Chinese Communist Party influence agents, and trying to counter Chinese Communist Party disinformation. And of course, if you're Xi Jinping, you'd rather pick up Taiwan peacefully than by force, right? So if you could get a sympathetic government in there that would start negotiating, and then you're on a different track, and over time you just kind of ratchet up the pressure more, and so on, that's definitely a preferable course. So there's a lot of uncertainty here, and I think it's going to be very important that the people of Taiwan see that they're not alone, that the democracies of the world, and now I would say not just the United States and Japan, but Australia and Europe are with them. And you know, it will increase the will to fight.
Wonderful, thank you. So going back to democracy versus authoritarianism, and as a social scientist, I'm tempted to talk more about the whether it is analytically accurate to divide all the polities in the world into two camps, and so one is democracy, the other is not authoritarian or autocratic regimes. Because today, there seem to be a lot of hybrid kind of models. People use labels like authoritarian democracy, illiberal democracy, democratic authoritarianism. There are all kinds of different kind of labels for these hybrid versions of polities. And you can talk about that as well. That'll be interesting to me. But perhaps more policy relevant issue is whether it is strategically wise to divide the world into two camps, as the United States seemed to be doing in calling the Democracy Summit last year. Because if you observe all these countries, especially Southeast Asian countries, African countries, we in the West would like to have those countries on our side. And to win their hearts and minds, it may not be the most effective approach to just preach them democracy. It's all about free voting. Because they need more of economic resources. They need to put food on the table. They care more about those issues. So in approaching those countries, I'm not entirely sure whether this framing of democracy versus autocracy is the best approach. So I'm wondering how you feel about that, and how what might be the best strategy in really winning the battle. I don't want to label one country as the only enemy, but China seems to be doing quite well, at least until Sri Lanka and Pakistan and so on, was doing reasonably well in making entry into those countries, at least at the government rulers level. So in winning the global South, which will be an important battleground for us, what would be the best approach?
Well, first of all, I think we need to make some definitions, because there's a lot of confusion in terms. When Americans use the term democracy, first of all, they usually mean liberal democracy. And liberal democracy actually consists of two separate sets of institutions that oftentimes go together but are conceptually and practically separate. So the liberal part of liberal democracy really has to do with a presumption of the juridical equality of all human beings, the existence of individual rights that those citizens have, and the need to protect those rights through a rule of law, through constitutional checks and balances that prevent an excessive concentration of power. The democratic principle really has to do with popular sovereignty and the idea that governments should be accountable to as large a portion of the population as possible, and institutionally that's represented through multi-party, free and fair elections. And different this is something I was thinking as we're getting ready for this panel. Different parts of the world are more aligned with the liberal part and some are more aligned with the democratic part. I would say that it's striking in Asia that Asians tend to like the liberal part more than the democratic part. So for example, in this part of the world, we use we want a rule-based order. We want a rule-based international order. That's not saying we want people to be able to vote for their leaders and so forth. What that means is basically we want a liberal order that establishes rules, limitations on the way that economic actors behave that makes them predictable. And therefore, a country like China that has no elections can actually participate in a rules-based order. And I think, in this country, that's really been the kind of underlying principle of the free and open Indo-Pacific, right? It's a liberal order, much more than it is a democratic order. You're not going to appeal to Laos or Cambodia or, even a democracy like Indonesia primarily by appealing to the democratic part, but you are going to appeal to them by stressing the liberal part. In Europe, it's actually, I think, a little bit the reverse, that democracy is really the source of legitimacy. And what's happened with the rise of populist regimes like Orban's Hungary is you get democratically elected leaders that...
Not democratically elected.
Well, no, he is Democrat. Larry Luck. No, it was a democratic, in terms of the will of the people, it was not a liberal election that happened according to procedural, to strict procedural rules. There's no question that he got a big majority of the vote in Hungary. And then he used that power to undermine the liberal part of liberal democracy. This is also what Modi has done. Modi has been very popular in India, and he's been eroding the liberal part of liberal democracy. The populist movements in Western countries have largely been democratically legitimated, but they're not liberal, including Donald Trump, right? So Donald Trump, by our rules, did win the 2016 election, but he wants to use the Attorney General to go after his enemies. And, he doesn't want to be, he doesn't want to follow the rules when he loses an election and so forth. And so there, I think you have a slightly different dynamic where the democratic part conveys more legitimacy, than the liberal part. And I think one further observation is just a kind of self-reflection about Americans. American national identity has been connected to the idea of both liberalism and democracy much more deeply than virtually any other country in the world. And in fact, just think about Japan or Italy or, Sweden. These were all countries way before they were democracies. And, they've got their own cultures, their own, food, their own history that way preceded the rise of democracy. Japan was briefly a democracy in the Taisho period, but then really after the late 1940s. And so when I think people in this country think about what is Japan about, the first thing is not democracy. It's really a whole bunch of other, cultural inheritances. And I think that that's just not true for Americans, because we're an incredibly diverse, ethnically, racially, religiously, country. We used to be much less pluralistic, but even from the beginning, you had a big racial division in the United States, and therefore you couldn't base American identity so easily over time, on race, religion, inherited culture, because we basically didn't have an inherited culture. It all came from other places, and therefore liberal democracy becomes the source of American identity. And I do think that Americans sometimes have a problem in not realizing that not everybody in the world is like that, right? That democracy means something very deeply to many people around the world, as does liberalism, again, in different proportions in different countries. But as a unifying principle, it works in some places, and we should take, advantage of it. But in other parts of the world, that might not be the thing that you want to lead with. It may be economic growth, and certainly for many developing countries, in a way, that's kind of an argument for stressing the liberal rather than the democratic part, because in general, liberal regimes have been better at, promoting growth than democratic ones.
Yeah, you have.
I want to make a couple of additional points. As you've already heard, one dissenting point. The most important additional point, Kyo, is it's not a democracy summit. It's a summit, it's not a summit of democracies. It's a summit for democracy. I think, and I was never that crazy about the initiative, to tell you the truth. When I look at how much of the person power and intellectual energy that the Biden administration has devoted to the future of democracy in the world, what a high percentage of that has been absorbed in just the planning for and agonizing internal debates over the Summit for Democracy, I'm not sure it was really worth it. But in any case, the framing, I think, was very valuable because it sought to at least partially avoid, maybe not adequately, the Cold War style division of the world into our side and their side. And we've seen in the UN votes on Ukraine and in a number of other things, the Indonesias of the world, the non-aligned movement, it's kind of back in a way. They're just not going to sign up to an initiative in which they have to line up behind the United States as pro-democracy against China, Russia, and so on and so forth. So that leads to my second point, which may get into whatever questions you have about what is to be done. I think we really need to fight for values. Democratic, and I would say to the extent we can, liberal values, but understand there's cultural differences in the world. But, our public diplomacy efforts have kind of lapsed in the United States. We still don't have a permanent Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy. I mean, it's really shocking. And we're not spending the amount of money in real terms on public diplomacy that which is everything from broadcasting to support for other international media and getting our story out and fighting for our values in international forums and so on, that we were a decade ago when the challenge wasn't nearly as severe as it is now in the age of disinformation. So there has to be, an element of pragmatism, a long-range view, trying to win a longer-term battle for what people think and believe, and a very vigorous battle to counter disinformation. Now, let me say why I think Hungary is not a democracy, because I think it's very important to understand this, particularly now in the world we are in. It's not enough for a government that emerges out of contested elections to have apparent majority support or even broad majority support to say, well, they had elections, more people in the country favor that party than any other country, so it must be a democracy. If that were true, we would call Singapore a democracy. And nobody is really calling Singapore a democracy. You've got to have at least a reasonably level playing field, which of course does not exist. It can't be perfect. It never is perfect. It's probably not even perfect in Norway. But you have to have a reasonably level playing field in order for competitive multi-party elections to meet, I'd say, a decent standard of democracy. And I think there's a fair amount of consensus among comparative scholars of democracy on this point. And I just will say emphatically, if you look at what Viktor Orban has done to gerrymander electoral districts, to crush independent media, to silence independent universities, to threaten intellectuals, to dominate the information space, you know, if he then wins as he did the last parliamentary election, and even gets a majority of votes as a result of that, you still don't know what the electoral outcome would have been if there were a level playing field. And if there were a level playing field, I can tell you absolutely, no one has any doubt that for now, the PAP would still be ruling in Singapore, but would have a lot fewer seats than it has now. And there actually was an election where Viktor Orban got fewer votes than the opposition combined, but you know, he won a 2/3 majority of parliament because he had gerrymandered the districts so much. And I say all this not just because I think Orban is a particularly ominous danger to democracy globally, because he's become a rallying point against liberalism and for the enemies of democracy in the United States and Europe, but also because the demise of democracy is happening incrementally and often silently, step by step, in a number of countries in the world. And if we don't recognize this process of somewhat silent decay and the growing climate of fear and the unwillingness of businesses any longer to contribute to the opposition because the tax man will be at their door and all the other things we could talk about, then we don't understand what's happening in terms of how democracy is dying around the world.
We're probably not going to settle whether Hungary is a democracy or not right here, but I want to cover two important points that a lot of people in Japan are likely to be interested in. One is, where is American democracy going? And number two, what does this all mean for Japan and the Japanese public? American democracy, already Larry talked a little bit about what ails American democracy and some of the solutions, but if you have some more to add, well, gerrymandering is one actually factor in the US as well. And you have some suggestions in your book about rank order voting and other things. And Frank, on liberalism, you have an entire new book on liberalism that is going to be translated into Japanese version, I trust. And you, in the book, you lay out some problems, excesses of liberalism in the US, both in the right and left. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that issue a little bit more and talk about how that might shape the future of American democracy in the coming years. Maybe start with Larry, if you have things to add about American democracy.
Well, I'll say the following things briefly. First, the positive. I do think there are signs that we've entered an era of political reform in the United States. I'm sorry to inflict this statement on Frank one more time. The poor man has to keep listening to me say this in such a variety of settings. But I do think our best prospect for depolarizing our politics is by adopting the electoral system that Australia has for their lower house of the preferential vote, the instant runoff, what we call in the United States ranked choice voting, and also eliminating partisan primaries so that you just have one blanket primary. The field is narrowed down to a few candidates, typically 4 or 5, and then this instant runoff is used to choose a majority winner among those 4 or 5. I think that system would be much more likely to choose a less polarizing victor in a lot of kind of contested outcomes. And there's some momentum gathering for that. It was adopted in Maine in 2018 in different forms. This instant runoff preferential vote was adopted in Maine in 2018, Alaska in 2020, Nevada this past November. It's going to be possibly, I think, on the ballot in Oregon in 2024, and the state of Minnesota, it looks like, is going to adopt it legislatively this year. And also, a lot of American states have been adopting other reforms that I'd say are good reforms for democracy, to increase the number of people who are registered to vote by making voter registration a more automatic process, by restoring the right to vote to convicted felons, because in the United States, the racial, the racial distribution of people convicted of criminal felony crimes is vastly disproportionate to African Americans and to some extent Latinos. On the other hand, what worries me is that even though I think Trump is a unique threat to American democracy, and it looks like his stock is falling, and I think Frank may want to say more about that. Sorry. I guess that cough medicine didn't work so well. Even though that's the case, I think that, I don't say this as a partisan statement. I mean, I also work at a conservative think tank, the Hoover Institution. But I think there are a lot of Republicans whose commitment to democracy is questionable at best. And there's a lot of there's a lot of anti-democratic sentiment among the MAGA base of the Republican Party.
Well, I think that there's been problems with liberalism in the United States that have been pushed both by the right and the left. The right-wing misinterpretation of liberalism is what we call neoliberalism, which was a set of economic policies that worshiped the market, that tried to remove the state from regulation, from state ownership or encouragement of economic activity, that really begins with Thatcher and Reagan, and really we're kind of at the end of that period that produced a lot of economic inequality. I think on the left, you've had this transformation of the left in many countries, but particularly in the United States and Europe, from parties that were based on class, meaning the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie, or poor people versus rich people, to one based on much narrower identities that had to do with race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, and the like. And in the process of that transition, it became, in the hands of certain progressive advocates, illiberal. That is to say, intolerant of people that didn't share that same social justice attitude towards these kinds of issues, and that in turn provoked a big reaction on the right. I would say that what drives most Republicans these days, it used to be low taxes, right, and government regulation, but in recent years, it's all been these cultural things that, they don't like critical race theory, or they don't like, transgender activists and this sort of thing. And so the nature of the politics has shifted in many ways to these kinds of cultural issues. And I think that that's what's screwing up American politics, quite frankly, right now. The right-wing part is being adjusted. I think that neoliberalism has been out, for at least 10 years now. The state is kind of much more prominent in terms of industrial policy, you know, protecting semiconductor supply chains and so forth. The progressive distortion of liberalism is a little bit more complicated because that's deeply embedded in you know, civil rights and our view of, you know, individual rights. And that, you know, continues to roil our politics. And for that, I wish I could offer you a simple solution of how to pull back from that, but I'm not sure I can.
Right. I'm sure there are a lot of people in the audience waiting for questions, and we'll turn to you in a moment. I just want to quickly ask about Japan. What can Japan do to contribute to upholding the international liberal order and democracies? Well, domestic democracy, as Larry alluded to, seems to be functioning reasonably well compared to other democracies in Europe and the United States. And Japan is dependent on international trade. Japan needs international exchanges of people, goods, resources, ideas to continue. And Japan is surrounded by authoritarian countries that seem to have strong appetite for more territories, more resources, and have powerful military, China, Russia, North Korea, and so on. So Japan, it seems obvious that Japan needs to contribute to defending of the international liberal order. And in that regard, what advice do you have? What can Japan do more of to make contributions in this regard?
Well, I mean, Japan has already done the right things, you know, at least in initiating, you know, so when the United States pulled out of the TPP, Japan took leadership and tried to revive it and keep the idea going as best they could, despite the fact that it lost its, you know, biggest original backer, and that was very helpful. And now in the security realm, you know, the planned increases in the defense budget, I think, are exactly what is called for to meet, you know, this new set of security threats that are, you know, very vivid and overtly military. And it'll be a question about, you know, follow through, as Oriana was saying. But that's a challenge I think that really all of us have. So I think Japan has done a pretty good job in all of this.
So I don't know enough about Japanese domestic politics to offer any advice to this audience. But I would like to offer this observation. I don't think it's quite right to say that Japan is surrounded by authoritarian regimes. It is, you know, maybe uniquely among countries in the world, well, not entirely uniquely. You want to know a country that's surrounded by authoritarian regimes? Mongolia, whose only two borders are with Russia and China. How'd you like to be Mongolia today? But Japan does face this extremely dangerous arc of Russia, North Korea, and obviously, especially, China. But I'll tell you when I think it will be much more accurate to say that Japan is surrounded by authoritarian regimes. And that would be if China conquers Taiwan. And then, you know, I'll just make this prediction. They're not going to stop there. Sooner or later, they're going to take the Senkaku Islands as well. And I keep saying, I think I heard Frank say it on this trip too, we've entered a kind of 1930s moment in this region where the overriding challenge is to deter and, if necessary, to defeat authoritarian aggression before the authoritarian regimes bent on aggression, but particularly China, become so powerful that it will be hard to stop them. And part of the tragedy of Europe agreeing to the Munich Pact that essentially signed away Czechoslovakia, and before that, just kind of shrugging their shoulders when Hitler simply completely overran Germany's commitments for demilitarized Rhineland and moved his military forces right there near the French border, is that Europe could have prevailed at much lower cost early on. And with each failure to act, the stakes became greater and the chances of success became lower. So even if all China does is take Taiwan, you know, what's it going to mean for Japan's ability to defend its territory? This is why, you know, I'm not going to name any names, but I have been struck. It's the single most important thing I've been struck by, that several members of the kind of political realm in Japan who have held or hold elective office have privately said to us that, yes, they consider Taiwan an existential, they consider ensuring that China does not forcibly take over Taiwan to be an existential issue for Japan. And I think now making that clear to the Japanese people and to Beijing has become a pretty important imperative for Japanese democracy.
Thank you. So Hosea-san has questioned.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I'm Yuichi Hosea. I'm a professor of international politics at Keio University, and also I'm a research director at API here. And I'm also a co-host, together with Yomiuri Shimbun, of today's extraordinary event. We have learned so many things from your talks, your gorgeous talks, and as Tsutsui-san mentioned in the beginning of this session, you are wise persons. That's why I suppose that wise persons can see or can foresee sometimes ordinary people cannot see. And so that's why I like to ask you, what is the biggest concern or worry about in Japanese democracy or Japanese geopolitical position today here? Maybe there are some points that we cannot see in Japan. Maybe you can see from the United States, and because Japan is another frontline state, together with, of course, Taiwan and as well as Ukraine. So that's why I think that we need to be aware of some of the problems or concern or shortcomings that we have in Japanese democracy or Japanese geopolitical position. So I'd like to know your wisdom about that.
I will repeat. I don't know enough about Japan and its domestic politics to give a very informed and even semi-confident answer to your question. But the most obvious thing that can be said is that, and this is not criticism of the LDP, some of the people we've met have been people who hold prominent positions in the party. And I must say, maybe I had a biased sample, but I found them to be very impressive individuals. So this is not a criticism of the LDP, but you know, whenever you have, it's the most obvious thing that's been said about Japan over the Japanese democracy over the decades. Whenever you have, you know, one political party largely dominating for 70 or so years, it's an area in which, you know, maybe one would want to cast some attention. So I think simply achieving more responsible and effective parties beyond the LDP is one obvious area. And then the second thing I'll say, with all humility, because the problem, I think, is no better in the United States, but I think many liberal democracies really struggle with the problem of money in politics. And I think that Japan and the United States struggle with it to some extent in different ways. I mean, in the United States, our Supreme Court has, to my mind, outrageously misinterpreted the First Amendment to gut congressional ability to regulate a lot of campaign spending that's independent of candidates. I'm sure the problem manifests itself in different ways in Japan, but I'd say reforms to somehow mitigate the influence of money in politics, and certainly to ensure absolute transparency in all flows of money into politics, you know, that would be a second thing.
Do you want to add or go to?
I don't know. I'm a little this is not a threat. I'm not quite sure whether this is the right place or time to say this, but in many ways, I think one of the biggest social problems that Japan faces is the one that former Prime Minister Abe identified. Your female labor force participation rate is way too low, right? And you know, compared to other developed democracies. And I mean, this is a subject for a much longer conversation, but I actually think that that's also related to the extremely low fertility rate in Japan, because I think that when you have a highly educated, fairly rich society with a lot of educated women, and you have that kind of socially conservative society, one of the responses of women is, you know, not to want to have a lot of children. This is not just in Japan. I think this is also the case in Korea and Singapore and many other, you know, Asian countries. And I think that that kind of social transformation, you know, needs to happen. You know, just for pure economic reasons, because you're underutilizing a really major part of your workforce. And so I would think that that's, you know, I mean, the low fertility has been recognized as a big vulnerability in Japan, but it's related to these other things as well. So as an outsider, that would be my, you know, my observation.
Thank you. Very quickly, Takanaka-san, a quick question.
Quick question. Since this session is on the rise of authoritarianism, I have been wondering, my name is Harukata Takenaka from Seisaku Kenkyu Daigaku in Daigaku groups. I have a question, like if you look at the situation in East Asia, the continental, I mean those countries located in the China Peninsula tend to be authoritarian, whereas island countries, except South Korea, Mongolia, tend to be democratic, Japan, Indonesia, Philippines, and Taiwan. So, but if you look at GDP per capita, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand are higher than Philippines or Indonesia. So what makes and you too have been observing these different type of regimes in many places of the world. What do you think makes it very hard for these South Asian countries on the Indo-China Peninsula difficult to democratize or sustain their authoritarian regimes? Thank you.
You know, these things, these alignments kind of change over time. In 1985, you would not have been able to say that maritime Southeast Asia is democratic, not Indonesia, not the Philippines. And with Thailand, it's a very puzzling country to me right now. But I will say that I don't think it's got anything to do with Thailand being on the kind of peninsular landmass or periphery or of China, or not that much. Obviously, the Chinese shadow is there; it's an influence. But when Thaksin Shinawatra rose up in the late 1990s, and then became prime minister, he really scared the devil out of the Thai elite and the Thai military. And I think it's important that we not glorify him. He was not a Democrat, in my view, but he was winning elections and doing it by mobilizing democratic electoral support. And I don't think Thailand ever really recovered from the military coup that displaced him. And then, that deep social cleavage between the countryside and the urban elite, or partly a class cleavage, partly an identity cleavage, it's just hung like a dark cloud over Thailand ever since. And it's not been able to get back. And the military doesn't particularly want to give up power. And I guess if I said this in Thailand, I could be prosecuted for lèse-majesty. But and since I'm going there soon, I better be careful. But I think the role of the monarchy recently has not been as, at times pro-democratic as it was at strategic moments earlier in Thailand. So I think that it's a lot of esoteric reasons, but we now have Anwar Ibrahim as the new Prime Minister of Malaysia. I don't want to glorify him as well, but you now have in Malaysia the most democratically, kind of philosophically committed to democracy individual who's ever led government in Malaysia. And I think, you don't know. They had one false start after UMNO lost that landmark election. But Malaysia could actually emerge as a democracy. So there's a lot of fluidity and uncertainty and possibilities in a lot of these countries. I don't know what to call the Philippines now. It's probably an electoral democracy, but of very low quality. Indonesia, I think it's pretty impressive that it's been able to survive as a democracy. It's got a lot of problems and challenges. The thing that strikes me is that a lot of these countries in Southeast Asia, obviously in the near term, that doesn't include Vietnam and Cambodia, but a lot of these countries could go in either direction. And I'll say one last thing that has been stirring in my mind for a long time. If Vietnam were a stock, I would buy it as a long-term investment, because I think it's going to be a democracy before China is.
Well, on that positive note, I'm afraid we are running out of time. So, and I apologize to those of you whose questions we couldn't integrate. And I'm going to turn it over to Sasazawa-san. But before that, please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists for their insights.
どうもありがとうございました。
Thank you very
大
much
変タイムリー
indeed.
でね、
It was
非常に
very
聞いてても興味
timely
深い興味の深い
and it was highly interesting.
ことがありました。
discussion that we have been listening to. Once again, I would like to thank the panelists, especially from Stanford University, all the speakers, and also the moderators as well. Now, as for today's discussion, on the 17th, tomorrow's Yomiuri newspaper, the summary will be given, and then on next week, we will have the whole session to be presented in our newspaper. Now we would like to end our session for now. And thank you very much once again. Please remind yourself to take all your belongings with you. Thank you.